assessments that are computer-based, computerized assessments, and that take account of dynamic assessment principles. I realize that dynamic assessment is pretty new in the language assessment field, so I'm going to try to do two things with the very little time that we have. One is to give kind of an overview of dynamic assessment because folks will have, I'm sure, varying levels of familiarity with that. An overview of dynamic assessment and pointing out that to date, most of the second language dynamic assessment research has been carried out in classroom contexts, much like formative assessment with dialogic interactions among teachers and learners, and then talking about how we took those principles and turned it into something that was that could be scaled up, something that was more standardized and could be used in a formal testing situation, and where that stands now, because this is an ongoing project. So I do have some data to share with some of the piloting that we've just begun with this with these new assessments. But again, we don't have a lot of data, and we're just getting into the analysis. We've got data coming in yesterday, even while I was here. So. Very quickly, the dynamic assessment, just I put this up, some of you will be familiar with this, of course. So dynamic assessment is not just a technical difference between, a technical difference from other ways of thinking about assessment, but it's actually very much a conceptual one because it comes from a different psychology, right? Assessment procedures and tests and so on come out of our theories of psychology, yeah? With the emergence of standardized testing in the 20th century linked to particular perspectives in psychology. Well, dynamic assessment comes from a different type of psychology. It's the sociocultural school of psychology that grew up in the early 20th century in Russia, associated with primarily with Vygotsky, the Russian psychologist, but also with many of his colleagues and then later his own students. And one of the important differences between, I think, the cultural, historical, sociocultural psychology in Russia, right, from many of the more Western theories of psychology, is this sort of relationship between human beings and their worlds, right? That just as our physical activities are mediated through physical tools and artifacts, our cognitive and psychological relationship to the world is mediated through concepts, through artifacts, and these can be physical artifacts as well as symbolic artifacts, and through activities, through participating in social activities, in activities with other individuals. And so this Vygotsky's famous dictum, what is first social becomes psychological. And basically what he's getting at is this idea that we're used to thinking about the psychological or the mental as being just what individuals are capable of doing independently, not in interaction with others, and often not relying on external artifacts, external tools. But what Vygotsky says is that, well, that is psychological, but there's also what he referred to as inter-psychological functioning, which is the ways in which we contribute to and participate in activities with other individuals. So you've got this dual layer, two ways of thinking about activities as both psychological and social. Because the first, right, when we're interacting with others, that's clearly social. But Vygotsky's arguing that it's also psychological. And the second we tend to think of as psychological, but Vygotsky's arguing that that's also social. Because developmentally, we go from intermental or interpsychological functioning to intramental, intrapsychological functioning. Right? And it's this process of internalization, that these forms of support, these forms of interaction become internalized as we move from relying on others to mediate. Again, remember thinking about that triangle, the crucial role of mediation. We go from relying on others primarily to mediate us, and we start to mediate ourselves. So it's a very, very different way of thinking about human beings. And there's a lot that we can say about mediation, and I can come back and hit on some of that if people are interested during the questions and discussion time. But one of Vygotsky's most famous proposals is the zone of proximal development, which is very widely known in education, in educational circles. And it really is getting at that sort of dual layer of intermental and intramental functioning, right? Because you have, on the one hand, the zone of proximal development is intermental, right? So it gets at participation in social activities, engagement, and contribution, right? Whereas Vygotsky contrasted this to the less well-known sibling of the ZPD is the zone of actual development, which is intramental, right? And developmentally, what Vygotsky's getting at here is that you have, on the one hand, the abilities that have already fully developed up to the present point in time, right? And we're relying on what we have internalized to regulate our functioning, the zone of actual development. The zone of proximal development, in contrast, is when we're still relying on others and artifacts to mediate our functioning. So these are two different ways of understanding what individuals are capable of doing. Now, with assessment, right, typically what we're looking at is just the one, the zone of actual development. We put a task before a person, and we ask that person to complete the task. And if there is an assessor sitting beside the examinee, then that person remains objective and makes observations. Maybe there's a stimulus of some kind, a prompt that the person has to respond to, that sort of thing. But it's really independent performance is what we're typically looking at. Yeah? What Vygotsky is arguing is that from this perspective, that's important, but you're missing part of the picture. You're not getting the full picture. Okay? And that through interaction, through providing support, right, through providing different kinds of interaction, you can get an idea of different ways in which learners respond. And so through research, Vygotsky and his colleagues found that, and this is an important thing, is that individuals respond differently to different kinds of support. Right? So you can have one individual who is struggling with a task, and through simply a reminder, or through simply saying, are you sure about that? Or do you want to try that again? That's enough for the individual to realize the source of problems and then to make corrections and to be successful. Whereas for other individuals, they might need very extensive support, guidance, direction, and they still might not be able to be successful. Right? So looking at, as Vygotsky would say, looking at their zone of actual development, can they do these things or not? Right? Are they capable of successfully carrying out these tasks, answering these questions, what have you? They look quite similar. Right? They can do some of these things, and then we get to this point, and performance breaks down. They're not able to do these other things. But when we look at their zone of proximal development, when we look at their abilities that are emerging and how they respond to support, we can see significant and substantial differences among individuals. So really what this is arguing for is, from an assessment perspective, I think, is broadening the evidential basis that we have for making interpretations about individuals' capabilities. Okay. And this insight is the source of dynamic assessment. It's been taken up. A lot of the pioneering work was done through the 60s and 70s in Israel, associated with Reuven Feuerstein, a psychologist there working in the context of special education. And then in different parts of the world, some of you might be familiar with the work of Jürgen Gutke in Germany, Anne Brown and colleagues in the United States with their approaches. And then it's only been within the last probably 7 years or so that these ideas have been brought into the field of second language learning. Okay. But one final note about mediation, about the idea of providing assistance, support, and looking at how individuals respond to that, is that, and these are some quotes from Vygotsky, is that there are limits to that. So the point of mediation is to look at responsiveness. It's not just to provide help to get an individual through a task. Right? The point isn't to say that, okay, well, you couldn't do the task on your own, but we gave you something, we interacted with you, and then you could do the task, so everything is fine. Right? The point is that it's diagnostic. It's to look at what kinds of support were needed and how the individual responded to that. Was a lot of support needed? Was it very explicit in nature? Was it implicit in nature? And then what does this tell us? And in what ways did the individual respond? Okay? Right, so to skip down. There are two broad orientations to doing dynamic assessment, to providing support, and one of those we've termed interventionist and the other interactionist. Interventionist tends to be very much a scripted approach to mediation. So you determine, I'm going to first provide this kind of support, and if that doesn't work, then I'll provide this kind of support, and then this, and so on. And usually moving from very implicit, so maybe, as we said before, would you like to try that again? Are you sure about that? To very, very explicit, narrowing the focus of the task, providing hints as to what the source of the difficulty is or how the task can be completed. Right? But it's very much scripted, and you go from hint 1 to hint 2 to hint 3 and so forth. Right? And it's the same for all learners. And because it's standardized, it's useful in interpretation, in comparing learners, right, just as you would with a standardized test instrument. Interactionist dynamic assessment, in contrast, is very open-ended, it's very dialogic, and this is what folks who've looked into the second language dynamic assessment research literature have probably seen. Okay, that's the approach that's been followed, and that's why it pairs very much with approaches to formative assessment, where the teacher doesn't know what the problem is going to be beforehand, and the teacher doesn't know what kinds of support a given learner might need, but it's being carried out as a framework for classroom interactions. Now, so what we've been doing with this study is thinking about how we can move, with this project, is how we can move from an interactionist approach and distill certain kinds of support or mediation down to something that can be standardized and used in a formal context, and that can be computerized. So instead of an individual, a human interlocutor, you have built into a computer program a series of hints or prompts or questions that can be made available to learners during an assessment. Okay. So here's this is from a paper that a study that was done just a couple of years ago, and this was a classroom study. Okay, and this was something that a classroom teacher came up with when a teacher of Spanish in a primary school setting, and she wanted to have a way of using dynamic assessment as a principle for systematizing her interactions with learners. So the reason I put this up here is because I think it shows nicely what I was mentioning before, sort of a hierarchy or inventory of mediation. So when a learner would make a certain mistake, and in this case she was looking at adjective agreement, noun-adjective agreement in Spanish. With her learners, that was a focus that they had. So she would first pause and see if that would create an opportunity for the learner to self-correct or to make an attempt, right? Then she would repeat the entire thing that the learner had said, but with a questioning intonation. If that worked, then they would move on. If not, then just repeating that one part of the utterance. If that didn't work, then using the English question, so what's wrong with this sentence? Switching to English and drawing their attention to the fact that there is something wrong with what you've said, pointing out what the incorrection, and then going on and on to giving an either-or choice, for example, identifying what the correct answer is, right? Saying, so this is what you need to say, and then finally explaining why. Right? So in terms of corrective feedback, you can see a couple of different things going on, reformulations and recasts and so on, that these can all be ways in which mediation can occur, but that the key from this perspective is figuring out at what point, how much support you need to give, and looking at how learners respond to that. Right? Are they able to then overcome the issue or not? And that's where you see this sort of this diagnosis appearing. Okay, so with computerized dynamic assessment, a couple of quick things. We were looking at 3 languages, L2 comprehension in 3 languages, Chinese, French, and Russian. I'm just going to look at some of the French data